new to all of this, coming to a church and being in a service like this, you'll notice that as Christians, we talk a lot about blood. That seems to come up in the conversation. We sing about blood. Now, I have been a follower of Jesus almost all my life. When I was 7 years old, I made that decision, but fresh out of the hospital, I was in the nursery at church, and so I have grown up with that language all my life. So it doesn't hit me in the same way it might hit you if you're hearing that for the first time. What is all this talk of blood? I mean, that's kind of bizarre, almost gruesome. But there it is. It's right there in the center of the Christian faith. Blood. And this letter that we're reading to these people who are, it's called Hebrews for a good reason. These are Hebrew people. These are Jewish people that he's writing to who have accepted Jesus as their Messiah. So they're Jewish Christians. And they are wavering in their faith because of some persecution that is happening during this time. And they're saying, we're just going to go back to the old way and the old system, back to animal sacrifice, which will take care of our sin issue with God, and we'll just go back to the old ways. Well, where did they get a notion that sacrificing an animal would have something to do with our sin and have something to do with our relationship with God? Well, it comes from God, because that's something that God instituted way back, but it's even referred to here in Hebrews. In fact, the law of Moses, and then even the bigger overall law of God, says that nearly everything will be cleansed with blood. And without the shedding of blood, there's no forgiveness. There's no forgiveness of sin without the death of something that gives up its blood. Now, from earliest times, as we look at archaeology and anthropology, we find on record that animals have been sacrificed, blood has been offered up, that has some kind of spiritual or religious significance to it, being offered up to a god or to gods, to a deity, for various reasons. Maybe to make up for some kind of a wrong that's been committed against this god, or to procure a blessing from this god, or just to ward off any kind of malevolent, out-of-the-blue behavior. But you find it worldwide in many different faiths and many different cultures. Way back in ancient times, and even today, it's still practiced. Now, where does that come from? How is it that so many diverse cultures have this understanding that there's something significant about an animal sacrifice offered up to a god? Well, probably for the same reason that if you look back or look around at all of the cultures worldwide, you find a common understanding or memory of a worldwide flood. It's found everywhere. That there was this cataclysm, and there was a man, a good man, who was instructed to build a boat, and animals came on board, and mankind was saved. Now, these variations are way off of what you read about in the Bible. Even the latest with Russell Crowe is way off from what you read in the Bible. But it's there, worldwide, continent to continent, it's there. It goes back to very ancient times. Where does that come from? There seems to be this ancient memory that permeates mankind that actually happened. What's recorded there in the book of Genesis actually happened. There are over 200 flood stories that anthropologists have found worldwide. You can look it up on Wikipedia. Well, the same thing is true. Where does this understanding of animal sacrifice, of offering up blood to a deity, where does that come from? Same kind of a thing. It goes back to the very ancient declaration that God made from the dawn of mankind almost, that no sin can be forgiven without sacrificial blood. And that understanding has survived even to this day. Well, why blood? What's so special about blood? Well, God's Word tells us that too. You go back to the law of Moses, you go back to the book of Leviticus in the Old Testament, and here's what God declares as he's talking about the necessity of animal sacrifice. He says, the life of a creature is in the blood. That's what keeps that animal alive. And I have given it to you. I've given you this ordinance, this ritual of sacrifice to make atonement for yourselves on an altar. Atonement, what's that mean? Well, break it down in syllables. It means at one-ment. In making this sacrifice, somehow that brings us back together with God, or would bring them back together with God, so they could be at one with God. Atonement. It's the blood that makes atonement for one's life. Life is in the blood. I came to understand that in a graphic way when I was a little kid. I had an aunt and uncle that had a farm down in Grant County, Kentucky. Uncle Russell and Aunt Blanche. Aunt Blanche was my mother's sister. And Aunt Blanche got a big kick out of me because I was a city kid. I grew up on the East Coast, close to Baltimore, lived in the suburbs. So as far as she was concerned, there was an awful lot about life that I didn't know, that I needed to know. So one day, I was just a little guy on the farm, and there was nothing better to me than I'd rather go to the farm with Uncle Russell and Aunt Blanche than go to Disney World. That was the best fun ever. Well, one day she says to me, she says, "Hey, why don't you come watch me dress a chicken?" Okay. What are we going to do? We're going to put a little hat and sweater on it? I don't know. So she grabbed this chicken and started doing unspeakable things to this chicken. And I got quite an anatomy lesson. I had no idea. And when we got to the dinner table that night, I wasn't hungry. I think I'll just have some salad. I did not know where fried chicken came from. It was awful. But the one thing that I came to understand from all that is when you drain the blood out of a chicken, that is one dead chicken. Yeah. Life is in the blood. We've got 1.5 gallons of blood, give or take an ounce or two, that flows through our body. And it makes the circuit every 23 seconds. And it's what connects every part of the body to every other part of the body. And it carries the oxygen and it takes the nutrients and gives the cells of the body what they need. And it takes away all the toxins and all the waste. And that's got to happen. And if that stops, if there is cardiopulmonary arrest, then we stop. We got to have the blood because the life is in the blood. And so God says that there is a sacredness to something that life is so very dependent on. The principle of blood sacrifice runs all through the Bible, beginning to end. In Genesis 4, when Cain and Abel came and offered sacrifices to God, Cain brought fruit and vegetables. Abel brought an animal from his flock. Abel's sacrifice was accepted. Cain's was not, because Abel's was a blood sacrifice. Genesis 9, when Noah came off the ark, he had an excess of certain kinds of animals, and he took that excess and he made a blood offering to God, and it established that relationship between this righteous man and God. In Genesis 22, Abraham sacrifices a ram that's caught in the bushes in place of his son Isaac. In Exodus chapter 12, we have the perfect Passover lamb that is offered, and the blood of that lamb spared the lives of the firstborn of the Jewish people who were in slavery in Egypt. And the lives of their sons were spared because of that blood sacrifice. In Leviticus, we find 5 offerings that were made for sin. There's a burnt offering, grain offering, sin offering, guilt offering, and the Day of Atonement. And 4 out of those 5 sacrifices involved the death of an animal. And it couldn't just be any animal. You couldn't offer to God some defective animal or the runt of the litter. It had to be perfect. It had to be the best that you had. And there was an inspection that would be conducted by the priest to make sure that this animal was suitable to be offered to God. The writer of Hebrews lands on the most significant of these sacrifices, and it was the sacrifice that took place on the Day of Atonement. This was and is the most holy day in the Jewish faith, in Jewish orthodoxy, because this was the day when the high priest would go into the tabernacle and through the tabernacle to the inner sanctuary. It's called the Holy of Holies. This was the place where they understood that the presence of God would come and be with His people. And you didn't just walk in there. Not anybody could just walk in there at any old time. It was only one day in the year that place could be entered. And there was only one person who could go in there, and it was the high priest. And he would take the blood of a sacrificed animal, and he would sprinkle that blood on what's called the mercy seat, the top of the Ark of the Covenant. And this would atone for, Day of Atonement, atone for the sins of an entire nation before God. There was one big problem, though, with all of these sacrifices, and even with that sacrifice on the Day of Atonement, they didn't really make things right with God. The priests did it year after year, day after day, year after year, went through these ritual ceremonies. Animal after animal died, poured out its blood to no effect. Day after day, every priest stands and performs his religious duties. Again and again, he offers the same sacrifices, which can never take away sins. Well, then why do it? Why in the world go through something that elaborate and have that many animals wasted on an altar when it didn't even do anything? It's an illustration. This was and is an illustration for the present time, indicating that the gifts and sacrifices being offered were not able to clear the conscience of the worshiper. They're only a matter of food and drink and various ceremonial washings, external regulations applying until the time of the new order, until something came along that did have an effect on the sins of mankind and did have an effect on the relationship between men and women and their God. You see, the law is only a shadow of the good things that are coming. A shadow. I cast a shadow right there. That's not me. That's just a hint of me, of the reality of me. And that's what these sacrifices were. They were a shadow, an illustration of a greater reality that was coming. They demonstrated the seriousness of sin. They affirmed in people's minds that only a death involving blood could satisfy God's justice that was demanded because of sin. And only a perfect sacrifice was acceptable. It had to be spotless before God. And so this was a hint, it was a shadow, it was an illustration of something, some new agreement between God and mankind, some different kind of a sacrifice that was coming that would eventually pay the price. It was like a minimum payment on a credit card. You can pay that and pay it and pay it and pay it, but it never takes care of the balance. Finally, you got to come up with a whopper of a payment to finally clear the account. And that's what these sacrifices were, minimum payments along the way until finally the sacrifice came that would clear the ledger. So that's what they kind of understood. That's what we fully understand, because we can look back with understanding at what happened. Sin is such a serious offense and has such a devastating consequence in our relationship with God. It is so highly offensive to God that God's justice demands that somebody has got to die. That's the only price sufficient that will satisfy the demand of the law. Somebody's got to die. Blood has got to be offered. A life has got to be offered if things are ever going to be made right with Him. And so I think we understand that. We get that if we think about it. Because even in our system and society today, we have what we call capital crimes. Crimes that are so awful, crimes that are so heinous. First-degree murder, premeditated, taking somebody's life, planning it out, and doing the deed. It's so awful that the perpetrator deserves to die because of it, to forfeit his or her life, or to at least serve a life sentence in prison. And whether you agree with capital punishment or not, you understand that, what that is, what the premise of that is. That there are things that are so grievously wrong that you deserve to die because you've done it. You know, if a serial killer was brought before a judge, someone in his right mind completely understood what he was doing and in a premeditated way took the lives of numerous innocent people and stood before a judge. And if the judge said to this killer, said, okay, here's what you do. Go get a goat and sacrifice it, and we'll call it square. Okay? You've paid your debt to society. We would be outraged if that happened. There's no way possible that could ever come close to paying the price that would be owed for such a thing. In God's economy of justice, every sin that is committed is a capital crime that prevents us from being at one with Him. Whatever the eventual punishment for that is, even to just be separated from God means death. The only place that we find true life, eternal life, is in a relationship with God, and sin is what prevents that. And so year after year, God held Himself back from demanding that price of justice, asking only that symbolic deaths take place until a sacrifice could be offered that was equal to the crimes of humanity that had been committed. You think of all the terrible things that have ever been done over the course of human history, all the sins that have been committed, the atrocities that we have exacted against each other, slavery, people owning each other and treating each other like livestock, the Holocaust, over 6 million Jewish people being killed simply because they were Jews. The conquerors that have swept across the face of the earth, pillaging, slaughtering, torturing. You think of what goes on today, the heroin that is sold to children, the way the children are abused and trafficked, and the lies that are told, the cheating, the stealing, the betraying, the bullying, all the hurt that goes on, that has gone on and continues to go on, and that we're even a part of, that's suffered by innocent people because of the sins of others. If these sins were stones, and if we took each one of these and stacked them all up from the beginning of humankind and stacked them all up, all of the sins that have been committed, it would be Mount Everest and more. And so what kind of a death could possibly satisfy what is necessary to compensate and to pay the judicial price of God for all of that guilt and all of that hurt? It would have to be gargantuan, wouldn't it? Certainly the death of a lamb or a goat or a bull could not begin to satisfy what's needed. I mean, that's almost laughable. I can't die for my own sins. For one thing, I'm not perfect. I'm not adequate. I can't die for my own sins. Let's die for your sins, and you can't die for me. We're not an adequate sacrifice. These sacrifices, year after year, drove home the point that mankind is sinful and sin separates us from God, and God takes that so very seriously. And only a death can cover the penalty that has to be offered in order to satisfy God's justice. All those animals served a ceremonial purpose, an instructive purpose, but not a deep down taking care of business purpose. Something that was truly perfect, truly life-giving, something acceptable to God as fair compensation for all the sins of mankind was necessary. And through all that time of all that sacrifice, God kept saying to us, someone is coming. It's coming. And it will happen. And that wasn't to be found here on earth. There was no one capable of offering up such a life. And so it came from heaven. God himself stepped in. God himself became a man and offered himself as that perfect sacrifice, that adequate sacrifice. And we know him as Jesus Christ. But when Christ came as high priest of the good things that are now already here, he went through the greater and more perfect tabernacle that is not made with human hands. That is to say, is not a part of this creation. See, the tabernacle and the temple, as real as they seem to us, were just a shadow of the reality of being in God's presence in the spiritual realm. And that's where Jesus went into that realm of God himself. He did not enter by means of the blood of goats and calves, but he entered that most holy place once and for all by his own blood, thus obtaining eternal redemption or salvation, the making things right with God. When Jesus was tried, when he was beaten, when he was stripped naked, when he was found guilty for crimes that he didn't commit, and when he was nailed to a Roman cross where he bled out completely, he was our high priest going into the Holy of Holies of heaven and bringing blood with him to offer to God in payment for all the sins and all the atrocities of mankind, including yours and including mine. And it wasn't the blood of animals or any other human being. It was his own blood. It was the perfect blood of the Messiah, fully God yet fully man, the blood of the one and only perfect man who had ever lived. And he offered that up to God. And as Jesus Christ hung on the cross, just before he died, just before he bled out, what did he say? He said, "It's finished." Finally, it's finished. And God said, "Yes, it's finished. The sacrifice has been made. Justice has been served. And now mercy and forgiveness can rain down on mankind." How much more then will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, cleanse our consciences from acts that lead to death, so that we may serve the living God? For by one sacrifice he has made perfect forever those who are being made holy. Well, what do we do with that? What do we do with that? Well, the one thing that we do with that is we understand the gravity of it and how profound it is that God went to the lengths that he did to satisfy his own sense of justice so that we could be united to him and not take that for granted and not live a sloppy life in response to that. There's a very hard thing that is said here in Hebrews 10, a very hard thing. Speaking to Christian people, he says, if we deliberately keep on sinning after we have received the knowledge of the truth, there's no sacrifice for sins that is left. How much more severely do you think someone deserves to be punished who has taken for granted the Son of God, who has trampled the Son of God underfoot, who has treated as an unholy thing the blood of the covenant that sanctified them, and who has insulted the Spirit of grace? What do we do in exchange for what Christ has given us? Christ makes such an exchange with us. He says, here's the exchange. My death I give to you, and in return you give your life to me. I die for you, you live for me. How do you pass that up? But he also says, don't be careless with that. Understand what a precious thing was given to you to make that possible. And don't take it for granted. Don't be careless with that. And when you sin, be sorry for that. Be sorry for that. And understand that mercy is there and grace is there. But don't take advantage of that. Don't live in an, oh well, kind of a manner. Oh well, grace covers all. just this once or twice or 10 times. No. Understand how serious it is to live a life in a way that is worthy of the life that was given for us. The second thing that we do with that is that we draw near to God, because the way is clear now. We've got a high priest. We don't need any more mediators. Christ is there bringing us to God, and we can draw near and close to Him to find everything that we need for life. So here's the encouraging message out of Hebrews chapter 10. Therefore, brothers and sisters, since we now have confidence to enter that most holy place by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way opened for us through this curtain. There is no more curtain or barrier to the presence of God, because we can go right through the body of Jesus. Since we have a great high priest of the house of God, let us draw near to God with a sincere heart and with full assurance of faith. No more fear, no more trembling, no more condemnation. Full assurance that faith brings, having our hearts sprinkled to cleanse us from a guilty conscience and having our bodies washed with pure water. We have been declared not guilty forever because of the sacrifice that's been made on our behalf. Let us hold unswervingly to the hope that we profess, for He who promised is faithful. Don't take it for granted, but live in a spirit of profound gratefulness and confidence and hopefulness because of what Christ has done for us. The days of guilt and fear are over because of that ultimate sacrifice that finally came.